So hopefully this will be a second recording, and I should be able to find that. This is going to be a lecture on dye. And this is something that I actually love doing. It's really, really fun. And it can really refresh clothing and make it a very exciting new way to see things. Before I do that, I'm going to take a photo of these things, of these instructions, so that I can post them, and then we'll go right on. We are very fortunate here at Santa Barbara City College that we have recently acquired a dye vat. I think I need to be further away. Okay. One thing that you want to do before you dye anything is make sure that you know the fiber content, because dye takes differently to every single fiber. So know your fiber content. And we know how to do that because we've had our fabric identification. So our fiber content we can find out by burning, by doing a number of different kinds of samples. Then you want to assemble all your materials. So this is just like in the makeup class, assemble materials. You won't have a dye vat at home, and I'll show you our dye vat, but for decades, I did it with a hot plate or your stove. This is something that we have always worn a mask. You see I have a full lab coat on, and I'll put my gloves on. That's because dye particles are airborne, and you can absorb them through any kind of thing, the pores in your skin, your nose, your mouth, your eyes, and they can be toxic. So that's why when we started in COVID, that was something that was familiar to us. So you have a hot plate, you have a large dye vat or pot, a thermometer, You'll see I'm using a meat thermometer. You have long tongs or a spoon so that you can stir. Measuring spoon. And a place to, I would say I use measuring cups because that's easy, but you don't need to have a measuring cup. You can use a yogurt container. This is to dissolve and mix your dye. And then you need your dye, your actual dye medium. So let's talk about dye. Dye has three portions to it. It has the hue or the color. It has the color media. It has the binder, which is going to stick the hue, the dye, to the fabric, and it has a medium, and in this case, the medium that we're going to dissolve it in is water. The binder that we're going to use is salt, non-iodized salt. So we have the dye, the binder, which is salt, and the medium, which is water. That's why this idea of dissolving is so important. You want to make sure that the salt is completely dissolved so that the medium, the dye will bind to the fabric and it will be a really saturated look. Okay, so these are the things that you need. The saturation is going to depend on the, not so much as the amount of dye, but the time that it's in the dye vat, the time that it's moving around in the dye vat. And I want you to think of this like pasta. You need a lot of water to get an even dye. So the dye itself does not dilute in the medium. The binder makes the dye absorb into the fiber, but the medium allows a full agitation of the piece so that it can be fully dyed without marring and without color. Okay, I'm going to show you our dye vat now. It's very exciting. We have it in a separate room. It has a high ventilation fan, and I'll show you where that is. So there's our exhaust fan right there. Before we had the dye vat installed, I went up on the roof to make sure that we had enough cubic inches per foot so that it was sufficient to what they called for. Here's our dye vat. It is really a soup kettle. Here's the top. We can lift the lid. This is the filler. And there's a vent inside so that nothing goes down the drain, which is here on the floor. And it drains out by opening this pipe. So in order to turn this on, this has a separate gas feed and heats its own water. We have to turn this on to the on position. You'll hear it. The temperature has to go up on the dye vat, and then I can fill this up. And this has been an incredible help to be able to dye things in a wonderful manner. And I had to dye, the very first thing I did in here was 5 1950s dresses to make them go to the color that we needed for a show. It was very exciting. Okay, now we're going to go outside to our low tech, which is the way I did it for years. It's how we got the saloon girls in Germany, how I dyed their good dresses. And let's go out there and take a look. So we're outside. That is a highly ventilated area. We're going underneath the awning. Yeah, better. Okay. And here's my dye pot. So I'm working with a hot plate. Just a second. I don't know why I have this. There we go. So there's going to be some noise here. This is a hot plate. I have it on high. I filled it with hot water. It has water to about here. Okay. I have my thermometer. I want to make sure that I'm having my water not at boiling, but it does need to be at a good simmer. I have my rinsing station, which is a tub of water right here. And I have my kettle so that I can dilute my dye. Let me turn that down. My measuring cup so that I can mix. And I have both nylon stocking and a sieve so that I can put my dye through a stocking so that it will not make dots on my garment. So that's something that we want to do. So before I put my gloves on, I'm going to cut some pieces of filter. just old nylon stockings. These are pantyhose that we made into seamed stockings. See that? We just zigzagged it. Actually, it went on the overlock. Crazy, huh? Okay, my measuring spoons. Want to talk a little bit about a couple different kinds of dye. This is our industrial dye packet. I dye things with tangerine because this says 51002, so it's 18 years old and it's almost full, so I usually use this for demoing. And this does say contains salt. It has sodium chloride in this, so I don't need to add that binder separately. I bring that up because this is the kind of dye packet you can buy at the grocery store. And it's about 1 tablespoon of dye, but you do want to add salt to this. This says it contains salt. They don't all, so you might want to take a look. Okay, so this is about 1 tablespoon of dye. Here's my dye, 1 tablespoon. And they say that will do about 3 yards of fabric. And then this is liquid dye. And this says color results by vary. We're going to use RIT. RIT dye is a household dye. It dyes a wide variety of natural products: cotton, linen, rayon, silk, wool, and nylon. So you know that cotton and linen are cellulose. Rayon is tree pulp, so it is cellulose. And silk and wool are protein fibers. Nylon is a synthetic, but it does dye. To this one, you add 1 cup of salt per dye bath. You want to use non-iodized salt because that is going to dissolve far more quickly. Okay, I'm just going to dye some muslin. Let me get that for us. All right. Sorry, there's a lot of noise out here, so just bear with me. Couple things before you dye. You're working with fairly high temperature. You can use RIT to dye polyester. It's just not as effective. It will give you a lighter color, so it won't be as saturated. They try to give you a hint of the color on the package. That's violet. This is sunshine orange. And when you're working with dyes like this, they don't give you the color. You're supposed to know what you're doing. So when you're working with a fabric, you always want to do a dye sample first so that you can see if it's going to be the color that you want. When you put your fabric in, it needs to be uniformly wet. So I'm going to go ahead and put that into my rinse water because right now there is nothing in there. So let me get my gloves and my mask on. Once the dye is in liquid form, it is no longer toxic because it's no longer airborne. So I'm just using my household rubber gloves. I have industrial gloves also. If I'm going to do a whole day of dyeing, I wear them and they come all the way up to my elbow, and they're much heavier because it's at high heat.
Do you find you dye often or a lot?
I do. I generally dye every production.
Oh, wow.
I'm wondering if I did. I didn't have to do anything for looking back, looking forward. But often there's, you know, it just seems like it works out. Here's this is our dye swatch. So I have a lot of information that I can go on. One class we did dye swatches so that we knew exactly what it was. It was very cool. So we did a 6-inch piece of muslin, and very as controlled as we could get in terms of the amount of dye, the temperature, and how long it stayed in the dye bath. So this is wine, cardinal red, scarlet, tangerine, sun orange. You can see that we did all the colors. So this gives me a lot of information. And then we did some in wool so that we could see different colors in different fibers. And then this was a synthetic blend. And this was what color did we use. Here was a print so that we could see this is a wool print. So, you know, this gives me information already. Here's a lightweight silk. You can see it takes color beautifully. So we have several of these dye swatch bundles that we've made based on the dyes that we generally have. This is a sample that we've also done in class. So here's a great look at a denim, and then a denim that has been over dyed. And this is something that we also do. So for example, West Side Story was a biggie that they over dyed all the jeans. If you do darker denim and over dye, it still will dye. It's just gonna be, look at that great color, a little bit different color. And then synthetics will dye. This dyed fantastically. This was a poly, it dyed differently. Here it was. This is the poly pink, and it dyed, over dyed in tangerine. This one was a rayon. You can see that it dyed from this pale gray to this, and the color and the sheen was actually sort of improved. This was the first piece I showed you. Incredibly vibrant. And then this piece, which had both red and just a second, let me get my gloves off. Red and white dyed. You can see that the white dyed very tangerine, and the red didn't change that much because it's in that red tone, but it did deepen it a bit. So that was pretty fun. Okay. Here we go. And now I'm going to put my mask on and start my dye process, which is going to be to get my samples wet here. I'm going to agitate them with my gloves on, get my filter set up, and then I'll mix my dye for you. Let me come right back. Okay, my 2 pieces of muslin are in. You want to make sure they're uniformly damp. You want to squeeze out any excess. This is great, like for old t-shirts. It's an amazing thing to be able to do because it just gives a refresh to a white t-shirt, gives you a whole new lease on life. Okay, so those are set. I'm going to use my big die. 1 tablespoon in here. And then we do something called paste up, which is you add a very small amount of very, very hot water to this dye sample to make your dye bath. So I have my craft kettle here, and I will gradually, I like to use a plastic spoon, add water a very small amount at a time. So you're first making it look like cake mix, and you want to add water until it is very, very smooth, and keep stirring until you no longer hear the salt. So I'm running my spoon around the outside edge to make sure I don't hear the salt. Remember that the amount of dye is not diluted by the water. It will bind to the fabric. I'm going to prepare my filter. So I'm going to pour my dye through the nylon stocking, which is around a sieve, so that it will be directional. If you pour directly off of the spout, it's not as good. So you can see that's a pretty small holes for that to go through is a mesh stocking with that. So I feel like I have this pretty well dissolved, but you will be surprised that there will be a residue in this sieve. I'm going to check my temperature to make sure it's warm and hot. I can tell it's almost boiling, and I'm going to turn it down. So I'll put in my thermometer and let's see what it says. I do have a bigger dye vat that actually has a thermometer built into it. And then I use the thermometer in the soup kettle dye vat. Like 180 is great, 200 is fine. It's simmering, so it's still moving. And again, you want to make sure that your fiber will withstand the heat. So one thing is you can measure your sample and put your sample in and see if when your sample dries, not only is it the right color, but has it shrunk, and do you need to take that into consideration with your fabric? And did it change the texture of your fabric? Okay, super. I'm at 200, that's ideal. So now I'm going to pour, sorry, I was just having this clear down in here so you couldn't see anything, but I was at 200. Now I'm going to pour my dissolved dye. Just one more stir because I haven't touched it for a second. Feels pretty good. Through my sieve. Now you can see that I have some dye left in here, and I definitely want all my dye. So I will pour more water in here to dissolve that. And look how much color this brings just from those few particles. So I'm definitely going to stir that. And then whatever's remaining in here, this will help get this dye out as well. That's the only way you can be sure that you're working with the right amount of dye. Okay, so that's pretty clean. And my sieve is pretty clean with my stocking. The stocking then can just get thrown away and my sieve will get washed for another day. So now I have my messy things, my measuring and stirring things, and I'll take my tongs. I'm going to stir to make sure that my water is equal and my dye is completely uniform in my pot. And then I'll take my sample, which is wet. And this is cotton. We know muslin's cotton, so it's a pretty light color. And I'm just going to dip it in and out. Let's see what it does. One dip. And remember, this is the color it was. So I'm going to leave that in there for a few minutes. The longer you leave it in, the darker it will become. Cotton dyes fabulously. So if something you think is cotton and you've burned it and doesn't dye really well, there could be a finish on it. You need to wash the fabric or the garment. And if it's a garment that you have worn, you may have perspiration or oil in it, so it will spot anyway, because those areas will be dense and they will take the dye differently. So even though we've been agitating just for a couple minutes, look at our comparison. And then you want to put it into, so I'll let you see how much water I have in here. So I have a good 6 inches of water. Probably not quite enough to do a t-shirt. You'd want it a little higher, just so that you have good agitation. Now I'm going to take this out. And I'm going to rinse. And rinsing is just about as important as dyeing. So I'm going to put it into my rinse water over on this side, and let's see how much dye discharges. So here it is. As I move it around, I know that my swatch is cool, so I can, my tongs are clean. I can move them back. Not a lot of dye came out because most of the dye was absorbed by the fiber. So you can see that this really took dye well and very quickly. And you want to rinse until your dye bath is clean. And that means you've gotten all the residue out. And then if I was doing a garment, I would wash this in soap to make sure that it would be good for an actor to wear. So it would be washed in soap, cold water only, and then it could be dried if you want to be able to dry your garment. But cold water wash, use woolite so that you're not bleaching it out. Definitely don't use a soap that has a bleach in it. No extra whitening soaps. But you can see that that's a wonderful color compared to the color we started with. So that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to go in and iron this on a paper towel. And I'm going to remove my gloves because I'm no longer dealing with toxics. I've rinsed my dye out, so it's no longer a problem. And let me dry this between paper towel and let's see what color it is. So pretty fun, huh? And you want to make sure when you're drying that you are protecting your surface so that you're not going to put dye on your surface. No, you turn the button on. So I'm going to put my paper towels down and dry in between just to see what the color will be when it's done. When you do this sample, you definitely want to use no steam. And then do it on a piece so that you're not going to make your ironing board turn colors, because that you really don't want your ironing board to be dyed. So I'm just going to get a few more reams of paper towel here. We have a roll. All right, let's see what happens. And you want to dry because that's going to give you your full color. Dyeing will lighten up when it's dry. Painting darkens when it dries. So if you're painting, you will darken when it dries, but when you're dyeing, it lightens when it dries. So you see I have left some residue, not a lot, and I'm almost completely dry. So I have a great color. Questions? There's our dyeing. Does it make you want to do it at home? I love this part.
Yeah, my friend does a lot of dyeing, and it always makes me want to like dye, but I never dye. I wouldn't know what to dye. Like, I don't think to dye things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm going to stop the recording.